The last thing a broken cowboy ever expects is to hear his own soul breathing again. The wind rolled low across the prairie, dragging red dust through the dying light of sunset, while Caleb Mercer hammered a loose fence post back into frozen ground. 20 miles from the nearest town, his ranch sat alone beneath a bruised Wyoming sky, forgotten by everyone except the coyotes and the ghosts. Folks in Bitter Creek still spoke his name carefully, usually after whiskey, usually in lowered voices. Caleb Mercer, the lawman who vanished, the husband who buried his wife and little boy after the fever came through 5 winters ago, the man who stopped speaking to God after that. Some swore he had not smiled since. Others claimed the silence around his ranch felt wrong somehow, like even the wind avoided the place. Caleb preferred it that way. Silence didn't ask questions. Silence didn't remind him what it felt like to lose everything worth loving. The old horse tied near the barn suddenly lifted its head and snorted hard toward the western ridge. Caleb paused mid-swing. Then he heard it too. Hoofbeats. Fast. Uneven. Desperate. He slowly set the hammer down beside the fence and reached for the Winchester leaning against the post. Out here, riders rarely brought good news after sundown. The shape appeared through the dust first. Then the horse. Then the woman. She rode hard down the slope with one hand gripping the reins and the other pressed against her ribs beneath the torn brown coat. Her blonde hair whipped wild behind her in the prairie wind, catching the last orange light like fire. The horse beneath her looked half dead with exhaustion. So did she. Caleb watched silently as the animal stumbled through his gate and nearly collapsed in the yard. The woman slid from the saddle awkwardly, boots hitting dirt before her knees almost gave out beneath her. She caught herself against the hitching rail with a sharp breath. For a second, she didn't even see him standing there. Then her green eyes lifted. Fear. Real fear. Not the kind people invented in saloons. The kind that hollowed a person out from the inside. Caleb had seen it before in soldiers coming home from war, in widowers staring into fresh graves, in mirrors. Please, she whispered, her voice dry from dust and cold air. Don't send me away. The wind rattled the porch chains between them. Caleb said nothing. Up close he could see dirt streaked across her cheeks, a bruise darkening near her jaw, and fresh rain stains dried into the hem of her dress. She couldn't have been older than 30. Something trembled in her posture, but it wasn't weakness. It was exhaustion held together by pure stubbornness. Behind her, somewhere far beyond the western ridge, faint movement stirred against the horizon. Riders. Still miles away, but coming fast. The woman noticed Caleb looking past her. They found me, she breathed. I thought I had more time. Caleb's jaw tightened slightly beneath the rough stubble. He should have walked back into the house. Should have let the woman remount and disappear into the dark. Trouble always arrived wearing desperate eyes. He had learned that lesson long ago. But then the woman swayed once beside the rail, fighting to stay standing, and Caleb saw something he had not seen in years. Someone more tired than he was. The cowboy looked toward the distant riders one last time. Then back at her. Get inside, he said quietly. And for the first time in 5 years, Caleb Mercer opened his door to another living soul. The cabin smelled like cedar smoke, old leather, and years of silence. Eleanor Hayes stood near the doorway with trembling hands while Caleb Mercer closed the heavy wooden door behind her and slid the iron lock into place. Outside, the prairie wind pushed against the walls hard enough to make the lantern hanging over the table sway gently back and forth. Caleb removed his hat slowly, but did not speak. The woman watched him carefully while trying not to show how exhausted she truly was. Up close, the cowboy looked even rougher than the stories whispered through western towns. Tall, broad shoulders worn down by labor and loneliness, dark hair streaked with gray near the temples, a faded scar running along his jaw beneath several days of beard. His eyes looked like winter skies over dead farmland. Cold, distant, tired. Yet there was something else hidden there too. Something buried deep beneath years of grief. Caleb crossed the room and grabbed a clean towel from beside the stove before setting it silently near her. Water is hot, he muttered. You should clean up before you pass out standing. Eleanor glanced toward the tin basin near the fire. Steam still curled softly above it. The sight nearly broke her heart for reasons she could not explain. Kindness always hurt more when you had not seen it in a long time. Thank you, she whispered. Caleb gave a small nod, but kept his distance. He moved toward the stove and poured coffee into 2 chipped cups without asking whether she wanted any. The motions looked practiced, mechanical, like a man surviving one day at a time through routine alone. Eleanor carefully removed her coat, trying not to wince as sore muscles protested beneath the fabric. Caleb noticed anyway. His eyes flicked briefly toward the bruising near her shoulder before turning back toward the stove. "You got family nearby?" he asked quietly. Eleanor hesitated too long. That was answer enough. Caleb handed her the coffee cup without another question. Their fingers brushed for barely a second. Strange how human warmth could feel unfamiliar after enough lonely miles. Eleanor wrapped both hands around the cup, letting the heat settle into her skin while she looked around the cabin. Everything inside seemed frozen in another time. Dust rested thick along the bookshelves. A cracked harmonica sat untouched beside the fireplace. One small child's wooden horse remained carefully placed on the mantel beneath an old family photograph, faded nearly white by sunlight. Caleb noticed her staring. The air changed instantly. His shoulders tightened almost invisibly. "Do not touch that shelf," he said. Not angry. Worse. Hollow. Eleanor lowered her eyes. "I am sorry." Silence settled again. Deep silence. The kind that made people hear every tiny sound inside themselves. The fire snapping softly. Wind brushing against the windows. A loose chain creaking outside the porch. Caleb sat heavily in the chair near the stove, one hand resting near the revolver, hanging from the chair post out of habit more than threat. Eleanor studied him quietly across the dim lantern light. This was not a cruel man. Dangerous maybe. Wounded certainly. But not cruel. Cruel men enjoyed power. Caleb Mercer looked like a man exhausted from carrying ghosts nobody else could see. "Those riders," he finally said. "How long behind you?" Eleanor stared down into her coffee. "Since Cheyenne Ridge. Maybe longer." "You steal from them?" She shook her head immediately. "No, you lying to them?" A pause. "Not exactly." Caleb exhaled slowly through his nose while staring into the fire. "That usually means trouble." Eleanor almost smiled despite herself. Almost. Then her expression faded again as distant memories crept back into her eyes. Caleb noticed that too. He noticed everything. The way she flinched at sudden sounds. The way she kept glancing toward the windows. The way exhaustion pulled at her shoulders like chains. Finally, he stood again and grabbed an extra blanket folded near the staircase. He placed it gently beside her on the couch without meeting her eyes. "You can sleep here tonight," he said. "Tomorrow morning you ride out before sunrise." Eleanor looked at him carefully. "And if they reach your ranch before dawn?" Caleb reached for his coffee cup slowly, weathered fingers tightening around the handle. Then he looked toward the dark windows where distant lightning flickered far across the plains. "Then," he said quietly, "they are going to wish they had not." Rain arrived sometime after midnight. Soft at first, then heavier against the cabin roof until the whole prairie seemed swallowed beneath water and darkness. Eleanor Hayes lay awake beneath the wool blanket on Caleb Mercer's couch, staring toward the ceiling beams while firelight flickered orange across the walls. Sleep would not come. Not after 3 days running. Not after every mile spent looking over her shoulder. Yet strangely, for the first time in weeks, she no longer felt hunted inside her own chest. Caleb sat near the fireplace across the room, silent as stone with a coffee cup resting loosely in one weathered hand. He had not gone upstairs. Had not removed the revolver from beside his chair either. The cowboy watched storms the way soldiers watched battlefields. Come outside. Exhausted underneath. Eleanor studied him quietly through half-closed eyes. Most men filled silence because they feared it. Caleb Mercer wore silence like an old coat he no longer noticed. The fire cracked softly between them. Somewhere outside, a shutter knocked once in the wind. "You should sleep," Caleb finally said without looking at her. Eleanor gave a faint, tired smile. "I forgot how." That earned the smallest glance from him. Not pity. Recognition. Caleb leaned forward slowly and added another piece of cedar to the fire. The sharp smell of smoke drifted warmly through the cabin. "Horses sleep standing up sometimes," he muttered. "Only way they survive storms." Eleanor turned slightly toward him beneath the blanket. "And what about cowboys?" Caleb stared into the flames for several long seconds before answering. "Cowboys survive by pretending they do not feel storms anymore." The words settled heavily in the room. Honest words. Dangerous words. Eleanor looked toward the faded photograph still resting on the mantel. Your family. Caleb's jaw tightened faintly. For a moment she thought he might ignore her completely. Then he stood from the chair and walked slowly toward the shelf. He picked up the frame carefully, like something fragile enough to break from memory alone. My wife, Sarah, he said quietly. And my son, Luke. Eleanor sat up slightly. Firelight reflected softly across the glass while Caleb looked down at the picture. The expression on his face changed in ways too small for most people to notice. But Eleanor noticed. Loneliness had taught her how to read broken things. Luke used to leave that wooden horse all over the ranch, Caleb continued. Could never find the thing when I needed it. His thumb brushed absent-mindedly across the edge of the frame. After they passed, I stopped moving it. The storm outside seemed quieter suddenly. Eleanor watched the cowboy carefully while the shadows moved across his face. I am sorry, she whispered. Caleb gave a slow nod, but kept staring at the photograph. Everybody says that. Then after a pause he added softly, nobody stays long enough to mean it. Something inside Eleanor shifted painfully at those words. She knew that feeling too well. The feeling of becoming temporary to the world. Caleb returned the photograph carefully to the mantel before sitting down again near the fire. Neither spoke for a while. The silence between them no longer felt sharp now. Just tired. Human. Then Eleanor noticed it. A piano covered beneath a white cloth near the corner of the room. Dust rested thick across it except for one single key recently touched. You play? She asked gently. Caleb followed her eyes toward the piano and exhaled slowly. My wife did. Eleanor pushed herself carefully from the couch despite sore muscles and walked toward the instrument. Caleb watched her but said nothing. She lifted the cloth slightly, revealing old ivory keys yellowed by time. One note sounded softly beneath her fingertips. Quiet. Lonely. Beautiful. Caleb looked away immediately as if the sound physically hurt him. Eleanor noticed that too. You have kept this room exactly the same, she whispered. Caleb stared toward the fire again. Some things stop feeling real if you move them. Eleanor stood silently beside the piano while rain rolled against the windows. Then very softly, almost too softly to hear, she began playing a slow melody. Nothing fancy, just a simple old frontier tune meant for cold nights and tired souls. Caleb froze completely in his chair. Because for the first time in 5 long years, music lived inside the Mercer cabin again. The final piano note lingered softly through the cabin long after Eleanor lifted her fingers from the keys. Caleb Mercer had not moved once during the entire melody. He sat frozen near the fire with his elbows resting on his knees, staring into the flames like a man listening to voices buried beneath years of dust and silence. Outside, rain continued falling steady across the prairie roof, but inside the cabin something else had changed. The room no longer felt abandoned. Eleanor slowly lowered the cloth back over the piano and turned toward him carefully. Your wife must have been very good, she said softly. Caleb swallowed once before answering. She played every evening before supper. His voice sounded distant now, pulled backward through memory. Luke used to dance around this cabin wearing boots 3 sizes too big. Eleanor smiled faintly at the image. Caleb noticed the smile for barely a second before looking away again. Strange thing about lonely men. Sometimes kindness frightened them more than danger. Eleanor returned quietly to the couch and wrapped the blanket tighter around her shoulders. The warmth from the fire had finally begun easing the stiffness from her body. For the first time in days, her breathing slowed naturally instead of from pure exhaustion. Caleb reached for the coffee pot again and poured fresh cups without asking. He handed one toward her silently. Thank you, she whispered. Caleb sat back down across from her. You play often? Eleanor nodded lightly while warming her hands around the cup. My father taught music in St. Louis before he died. St. Louis is a long way from Wyoming. Feels farther every year. Caleb studied her quietly over the rim of his cup. The firelight softened the hard lines in his face just enough for Eleanor to glimpse the man he must have been before grief hollowed him out. She could almost imagine him laughing once. Almost. Then the cowboy's expression shifted suddenly. Subtle. Alert. His eyes moved toward the dark window beside the door. Eleanor noticed immediately. What is it? She whispered. Caleb stood slowly from his chair without answering. The old floorboards creaked beneath his boots as he crossed toward the window. Rain streaked the glass, silver beneath flashes of distant lightning. At first Eleanor saw nothing except darkness and blowing prairie grass. Then she heard it. Faint. Almost swallowed by the storm. Hoofbeats. Caleb pulled the curtain aside barely an inch. His jaw tightened instantly. 3 riders, he said quietly. Maybe 4. Eleanor's fingers locked around the coffee cup so tightly her knuckles turned pale. They found me. Caleb remained still at the window, watching the distant lantern lights moving slowly across the ridge nearly half a mile out. Not yet, he muttered. Storm bought us time. Eleanor rose carefully from the couch despite trembling legs. Fear moved through her again now, cold and familiar. She had spent weeks running from that feeling. Yet somehow standing inside Caleb Mercer's cabin made the fear worse in one dangerous way. She no longer feared only for herself. I should leave, she whispered suddenly. Caleb looked back at her sharply. In this storm? If they reach your ranch because of me, they already reached my ranch because of you. His voice remained calm but firm. Eleanor lowered her eyes. Shame settled heavily inside her chest. You do not understand who those men are. Caleb walked slowly toward the gun belt hanging beside the staircase and lifted it with practiced hands. No, he said quietly while fastening the holster around his waist. I understand exactly what kind of men chase a woman across 2 states during a thunderstorm. The room fell silent again except for rain hammering the roof. Eleanor watched him check the lantern oil beside the door, then reach calmly for the Winchester resting near the fireplace. None of his movements looked panicked, only prepared, like a man who stopped expecting peace a long time ago. Caleb, she said softly. The cowboy paused. It was the first time she had spoken his name aloud. Something flickered across his face too quickly to fully see. Eleanor swallowed carefully before continuing. I do not want anyone else getting hurt because of me. Caleb looked at her for several long seconds while thunder rolled low across the plains. Then he reached for his hat hanging beside the door and settled it slowly onto his head. Miss Hayes, he said quietly. People stopped getting close to me years ago because they were afraid I had nothing left worth saving. He opened the chamber of the rifle with one steady motion before looking back toward the storm outside. Funny thing is, he murmured, you walked into this cabin yesterday and somehow made liars out of all of them. The storm carried on through the night, rolling low across the Wyoming plains while lantern light flickered against the cabin walls like restless ghosts. Caleb Mercer stood near the front window with the Winchester resting loosely in his hands, watching the distant riders move slowly along the ridge through curtains of rain. They were searching carefully now, patiently. Men only searched like that when they believed something belonged to them. Behind him, Eleanor Hayes remained near the fireplace, silent beneath the blanket wrapped around her shoulders. The warmth no longer reached her. Fear had returned too deeply for that. Caleb never looked back at her while he spoke. You have got about 10 minutes before they reach the lower pasture. Eleanor lowered her eyes toward the floorboards. Then I should leave before they see your horses. Caleb gave the faintest shake of his head. Too late for that. Another flash of lightning briefly illuminated the prairie outside. 4 riders now. Maybe 5. Dark shapes moving through rain and dust with lanterns swaying from their saddles. Eleanor's breathing tightened. Caleb noticed immediately. Sit down, he said quietly. You look ready to faint. I am not afraid for myself. That finally made him turn around. Firelight caught the tired edges of his face while thunder rolled low beyond the hills. Eleanor stepped closer to him slowly, her voice barely above the sound of rain. Those men work for my husband's family. Caleb's expression hardened slightly. Husband. She nodded once. Nathaniel Hayes. The cowboy studied her in silence. Eleanor could almost hear him fitting the pieces together inside his mind. The expensive riding coat she arrived in. The way she spoke. The fear hidden beneath every movement. Caleb rested the rifle carefully against the wall beside the door. You ran from your husband? Eleanor stared into the fire instead of answering directly. Nathaniel owns rail lines in Denver and cattle land in Kansas. His father owns judges. She swallowed slowly. Men like them do not hear the word no very often. Caleb's jaw tightened again, though his voice remained calm. And what did you do that made rich men ride through storms to find you? Eleanor hesitated. Then finally she whispered, I left. The cabin fell silent except for rain striking the roof. Caleb looked at her for a long moment before giving the smallest nod imaginable. Not judgment. Understanding. Strange thing about wounded people. They recognized cages even when the bars were invisible. Eleanor wrapped her arms tighter around herself. Nathaniel was not cruel in the ways people expect, she continued softly. That almost made it worse. Caleb said nothing. Everything looked perfect from outside. Beautiful house. Fancy dinners. Smiling photographs. Her voice weakened slightly. But after enough years, you realize somebody can hold your soul so tightly that you stop hearing your own thoughts anymore. Caleb leaned one shoulder against the wall beside the door while listening quietly. Eleanor looked toward him with tired green eyes reflecting firelight. When I disappeared 3 weeks ago, Nathaniel told everyone I was confused, emotional, unwell. A bitter smile touched her lips for barely a second. Funny how quickly a woman becomes crazy once she stops obeying. The cowboy stared at her silently. Something dark moved behind his eyes then. Not anger exactly. Memory. Eleanor noticed the change immediately. You understand that look? She whispered. Caleb exhaled slowly through his nose. I used to wear a badge before this ranch. Eleanor blinked softly. You were a lawman? Long time ago. The rain hammered harder against the windows. Caleb glanced once toward the riders nearing the lower field before continuing quietly. Saw plenty of rich men use pretty words to hide ugly things. Eleanor looked down at her trembling hands. I did not mean to bring this to your door. Caleb walked toward the stove and poured fresh coffee into another cup, even though neither of them truly wanted any. It was simply something to do with restless hands. Truth is, he murmured while handing the cup toward her, this door has not seen much life in years. Their fingers brushed again briefly. Warm this time. Human. Eleanor looked up at him carefully. Too carefully. Caleb noticed that too and quickly stepped back toward the window before the silence between them could become dangerous in another way entirely. Outside, the riders finally reached the outer pasture fence. Lanterns moved slowly through the darkness, only 300 yards from the house now. Caleb settled his hat lower onto his head and reached again for the Winchester beside the door. Then very quietly, without taking his eyes off the storm, he asked the question Eleanor feared most. Miss Hayes, he said, what exactly are those men willing to do to bring you home? The question lingered heavily inside the cabin while rain rattled the windows and distant lanterns drifted slowly across Caleb Mercer's lower pasture. Eleanor Hayes lowered her eyes toward the coffee, trembling faintly in her hands. For several long seconds, she said nothing at all. Caleb did not rush her. Men who had survived enough grief-learned silence could tell the truth better than pressure ever could. Finally, Eleanor spoke so softly the storm nearly swallowed her words. They will not stop. Caleb leaned against the wall beside the window, his broad shoulders motionless beneath the lantern light. That does not answer my question. Eleanor drew in a slow breath. Nathaniel believes people belong to him once he loves them. Caleb's expression darkened slightly. That is not love. A sad smile touched her lips for barely a moment. I know that now. Outside, one rider separated briefly from the others near the fence line before circling back through the storm. Careful men. Wealthy men usually hired careful men. Caleb watched them silently while Eleanor stared into the fire. The first time I tried leaving, she continued quietly, Nathaniel sent flowers to every hotel from Denver to Omaha until somebody recognized my name. Caleb said nothing. The second time, he promised he only wanted to talk. Her fingers tightened around the coffee cup. After that, I stopped believing promises. The cowboy slowly pushed away from the wall and walked toward the table near the fireplace. He set the rifle carefully beside it before removing his gloves one finger at a time. Eleanor watched him quietly. Why are you helping me? She asked suddenly. Caleb paused halfway through removing the second glove. The question settled strangely between them because neither truly knew the answer anymore. At first it had been instinct, then responsibility. But now something far more dangerous had begun taking root beneath the silence. Caleb lowered the gloves onto the table and stared toward the fire for several seconds before answering. Maybe because I know what it feels like when a house stops feeling safe. Eleanor's eyes lifted slowly toward him. Caleb did not look back at her while speaking. After Sarah died, people kept telling me time would heal things. A bitter breath escaped him quietly. Truth is, time just teaches you how to carry emptiness without falling apart in public. Eleanor listened carefully while thunder rolled low beyond the hills. Caleb rested one hand against the edge of the table. Some mornings I woke up and forgot why I was supposed to keep going. His voice stayed calm. Too calm. The kind of calm only lonely people mastered. Then one day enough years passed that silence becomes easier than living. Eleanor felt something ache deep inside her chest at those words. Because beneath all the rough edges and worn shadows, Caleb Mercer sounded less like a dangerous cowboy and more like a man stranded far from himself. The storm outside briefly softened. Rain slowed against the roof. In the distance, the riders stopped moving entirely near the outer pasture. Waiting now. Watching. Caleb noticed immediately. They are deciding whether to come closer tonight or wait until morning. Eleanor stood from the couch quickly despite exhaustion. Then I should leave before sunrise. Caleb finally looked directly at her. You think riding alone into that storm fixes this? It keeps your ranch out of it. Caleb gave a slow shake of his head. My ranch got involved the second I opened that door. Eleanor stepped closer to him carefully, blanket still wrapped around her shoulders. You do not owe me anything. Caleb's eyes held hers for several long seconds beneath the soft lantern glow. Maybe not. Silence stretched between them again. Heavy now? Personal. Eleanor became painfully aware of how close they stood near the firelight while rain whispered against the windows. Caleb smelled faintly of cedar smoke, leather, and cold prairie wind. Human smells. Honest ones. The cowboy looked away first. Get some sleep, he murmured quietly. You are no good to anybody exhausted. Eleanor hesitated. And you? Caleb reached for the Winchester resting beside the table and checked the chamber once more out of habit. I stopped sleeping good years ago. He walked back toward the front window while the floorboards creaked softly beneath his boots. Eleanor watched him stand there alone against the storm beyond the glass, broad shoulders outlined by lantern light and darkness together. A man guarding a house that had not truly been alive in years. Then very softly, almost before she could stop herself, she asked the one question nobody in town probably dared ask Caleb Mercer anymore. What happened to the man you used to be? Caleb stared out toward the waiting riders beyond the pasture fence. For a long time he did not answer at all. Then finally, without turning around, the lonely cowboy spoke in a voice so quiet it nearly disappeared into the storm. He died with his family. The storm finally began drifting east sometime before dawn, leaving the prairie wrapped in cold silver mist beneath a fading moon. Caleb Mercer still stood near the front window with the Winchester resting loosely against his shoulder while the riders remained beyond the pasture fence like shadows refusing to disappear. They had built no fire. Men hunting something valuable rarely slept deeply. Behind him, Eleanor Hayes sat quietly at the edge of the couch with the blanket gathered around her knees. Neither had spoken for several minutes after Caleb admitted the man he used to be died with his family. Some truths carried too much weight for immediate answers. The cabin felt different now. Smaller somehow. More honest. Eleanor studied the cowboy through the dim lantern glow while he stared into the darkness outside. She realized then that Caleb Mercer did not fear death nearly as much as he feared feeling alive again. That was the danger she had brought into this lonely house. Not trouble from riders. Hope. The thought unsettled her more than the storm ever could. You should rest for an hour, she said softly at last. Caleb shook his head once without turning around. If they move closer, I want to hear them. Eleanor lowered her eyes. You cannot stand guard forever. A faint breath escaped him that almost sounded like humor. Been doing it most my life. She watched him carefully. There was something deeply sad about the way he said things like that. Like a man who stopped expecting tenderness long ago and learned to survive on endurance instead. Outside, the horses beyond the pasture shifted faintly through the fog. Caleb's eyes narrowed slightly. They are waiting for daylight now. Eleanor rose slowly from the couch despite exhaustion still pulling at her bones. She stepped beside him near the window, close enough to hear the quiet rhythm of his breathing beneath the storm silence. If they see me here after sunrise, she whispered, they will not leave peacefully. Caleb kept his eyes forward. I figured that much out already. Eleanor swallowed carefully before speaking again. Nathaniel's father has judges, sheriffs, newspapermen. They bury problems with money. Caleb finally glanced down at her. And what are you? Eleanor met his eyes softly. A problem that stopped obeying. The cowboy looked at her for several long seconds beneath the pale lantern light. Something passed silently between them then. Recognition, maybe. Or loneliness finding itself reflected in another pair of tired eyes. Eleanor quickly looked away first. Dangerous thing about broken people. Sometimes they understood each other too easily. Caleb reached for the coffee pot near the stove only to realize it had gone cold hours ago. He muttered quietly under his breath and moved to relight the burner. Eleanor watched him in silence while he worked. Even his smallest movements carried restraint. Careful hands. Quiet habits. A man who lived alone long enough to stop wasting motion. You know, Eleanor said softly. People in town probably think you are terrifying. Caleb poured fresh water into the pot. Most folks leave me alone. That is good enough. But they are wrong about you. The cowboy paused slightly at that. Barely noticeable. Then he resumed his work again without answering. Eleanor stepped closer to the stove, warming her hands near the faint rising heat. You are not cruel, Caleb. He stared down at the coffee pot for a moment before speaking quietly. No, just tired. The honesty in his voice hurt more than anger would have. Eleanor looked toward the faded family photograph still resting on the mantel. You love them very much. Caleb's expression softened in ways almost invisible. Sarah used to sing while hanging laundry outside. A faint ghost of memory touched his eyes. Could hear her halfway across the ranch. Eleanor smiled gently. I think she would hate seeing this cabin so quiet. That finally pulled something unexpected from him. Not a laugh exactly. Smaller. Sadder. But real. Caleb lowered his head slightly, while shaking it once beneath the faintest smile she had seen touch his face all night. The sight nearly stole the air from Eleanor's lungs because suddenly she could see him. Not the lonely cowboy people whispered about. Not the ghost guarding an empty ranch. Just a weary man trying to remember how to exist after loss hollowed him out. Then the sound came. A distant horse approaching from the south pasture alone. Caleb's smile vanished instantly. He moved toward the window in one smooth motion, while Eleanor's heartbeat stumbled hard inside her chest. Through the morning fog, a single rider slowly emerged from the darkness carrying a lantern high beside his saddle. Caleb's eyes hardened immediately. That is not one of the men from the ridge, he murmured quietly. The rider stopped near the outer gate without crossing it. Then through the cold Wyoming dawn, a familiar voice carried softly across the prairie wind. Mrs. Hayes, the man called out calmly. Your husband would very much like you to come home. The rider waited beyond the outer gate, while pale dawn slowly spread across the prairie like cold smoke. His lantern swayed gently beside the saddle, casting long shadows through the morning fog. Caleb Mercer stood motionless near the cabin window with one hand resting on the Winchester, while Eleanor Hayes froze beside the fireplace, all color draining from her face. She recognized the voice immediately. Who is he? Caleb asked quietly without taking his eyes off the rider. Eleanor swallowed hard. Walter Grayson. The cowboy's expression did not change. Friend of your husband? Worse. Outside, the horse shifted impatiently beneath the rider while the distant men near the ridge remained watching through the mist. Caleb noticed everything. The spacing between riders. The stillness. The confidence. These were not reckless men. They believed the outcome already belonged to them. Walter lifted his lantern slightly higher. Mrs. Hayes, he called again, his voice calm enough to sound polite. You have caused considerable worry. Eleanor wrapped her arms around herself tightly, as if trying to disappear inside the blanket. Caleb glanced briefly toward her trembling hands before stepping away from the window. Stay inside, he said quietly. Eleanor's eyes widened. Caleb, inside. The single word carried enough calm authority to stop her instantly. Caleb reached for his hat hanging beside the door and settled it low over his brow before opening the cabin slowly. Cold morning air rushed inside, carrying rain, wet earth, and distant horse sweat. Eleanor watched from the doorway as Caleb stepped onto the porch alone. The old wood creaked softly beneath his boots while fog rolled low across the pasture fences. Walter Grayson sat tall in the saddle near the gate wearing a dark wool coat untouched by dust despite the storm. Clean gloves. Silver watch chain. The kind of man rich families trusted because he looked civilized while doing ugly work quietly. His eyes moved over Caleb carefully. Caleb Mercer, Walter said calmly. I had a feeling this ranch belonged to you. Caleb rested one shoulder against the porch post. Funny. I was just thinking I did not recognize you at all. Walter gave a faint smile that never reached his eyes. Mrs. Hayes is distressed. Her husband only wishes to bring her home. Caleb looked out toward the distant riders waiting beyond the ridge. Looks like a lot of men for one worried husband. Walter's smile faded slightly. Nathaniel Hayes values his wife deeply. Inside the cabin, Eleanor closed her eyes painfully at the sound of those words. Caleb noticed through the doorway behind him. Then he looked back toward Walter with quiet understanding settling colder across his face. She does not want to go back. Walter sighed softly like a man tired of explaining obvious things to children. Women say many emotional things when they are confused. Caleb's jaw tightened almost invisibly. Careful. The single word drifted across the fog, low and dangerous. Walter studied the cowboy silently for a moment before speaking again. You used to wear a badge, Mercer. That means you understand lawful marriage. Caleb remained still. Lawful and willing are not always the same thing. The fog shifted between them, while distant thunder rolled somewhere far across the plains. Walter removed one glove slowly. Nathaniel Hayes is offering considerable compensation for your cooperation. Caleb almost looked amused at that. Almost. You think I opened my door for money? Walter's eyes narrowed slightly. Then perhaps you opened it because lonely men make foolish decisions when beautiful women arrive asking for help. Inside the cabin, Eleanor's breath caught softly. Caleb did not move for several long seconds. The prairie wind brushed against his coat while the rider waited calmly beyond the gate. Then the cowboy stepped down from the porch one slow boot at a time. Not threatening. Worse. Certain. Walter's horse shifted nervously as Caleb approached through the fog. Listen carefully, Caleb said quietly. You and your friends have been sitting outside my land all night pretending this is some polite conversation. His gray eyes never left Walter's face. But the woman inside that cabin crossed 2 states to get away from your employer. Walter's expression hardened now. Mrs. Hayes is not thinking clearly. Caleb stopped walking only 10 feet from the gate. No, he said softly. I think for the first time in years she finally is. Silence spread heavily across the pasture. Even the distant riders remained perfectly still through the fog. Walter studied Caleb carefully, then glanced toward the cabin door where Eleanor stood half hidden in the shadows behind him. You are making this difficult, Walter said quietly. Caleb followed his gaze toward the doorway for the briefest second. And something dangerous happened then. Because when his eyes met Eleanor's across the cold morning light, the lonely cowboy realized he no longer cared whether this became difficult at all. The prairie remained silent after Caleb Mercer's final words, the kind of silence that settled before lives changed forever. Fog drifted slowly across the pasture, while Walter Grayson sat motionless in the saddle, studying the cowboy standing before him. Somewhere behind the clouds, dawn finally began breaking over Wyoming, washing pale gold across wet grass and weathered fences. Walter removed his gloves carefully, one finger at a time. You are choosing a dangerous road over a woman you barely know, he said calmly. Caleb never looked away from him. Maybe. Walter glanced toward the cabin again where Eleanor Hayes stood frozen in the doorway with tears gathering quietly in her tired green eyes. You think this ends here? Walter asked softly. Nathaniel Hayes does not lose things he believes belong to him. Caleb's expression remained still as stone. That sounds like Nathaniel's problem. For the first time since arriving, irritation cracked faintly through Walter's polished calm. You were once respected, Mercer. A lawman. Men used to speak your name with honor. Caleb lowered his gaze briefly toward the muddy ground between them before answering in a voice roughened by years of silence. No, they used to speak my name with fear. The wind shifted softly through the pasture. Walter studied him another long moment before finally reaching for the reins. You cannot hide her forever. Caleb looked toward the cabin doorway then. Really looked. Eleanor stood wrapped in the old wool blanket while morning light touched her face for the first time since arriving at the ranch. Exhausted, frightened, yet somehow stronger than the woman who rode through his gate 2 nights earlier. Strange what safety could do to a soul starved of it long enough. Caleb turned back toward Walter slowly. I do not think she needs hiding anymore. Walter followed his eyes toward Eleanor once more. Something in his expression changed then. Not kindness. Understanding. The kind dangerous men gained after years working for powerful families. He sighed quietly and gathered the reins tighter in one hand. Nathaniel will come himself next time, he warned. Caleb gave the faintest nod. Then next time he can ask her what she wants. Walter stared at him for several seconds longer before finally pulling the horse around toward the distant riders waiting beyond the ridge. One by one the lanterns disappeared slowly into the morning fog until only silence remained behind. Caleb stood motionless in the pasture long after the last rider vanished. The cold wind brushed through his coat, while pale sunlight crept across the lonely ranch. Then soft footsteps sounded behind him. Eleanor stopped beside the porch railing only a few feet away, still wrapped in the blanket. Neither spoke immediately. Some moments became too large for words. Caleb finally removed his hat slowly and rubbed one tired hand across the back of his neck. "You should probably head east by noon," he muttered quietly. Eleanor looked at him carefully. "Do you want me to leave?" The cowboy stared out across the wet prairie instead of answering directly. "This ranch is not much company." Eleanor smiled faintly through tired eyes. "Neither am I." That almost pulled another smile from him. Almost. Caleb leaned both hands against the porch rail while morning sunlight warmed the edges of the fields around them. For the first time in years, the ranch no longer felt empty. The realization unsettled him deeply. Eleanor stepped beside him quietly. "When I was little," she said softly, "my father used to tell me lonely people are not dangerous." Caleb glanced toward her. "What did he call them?" Eleanor looked out across the endless Wyoming plains where the storm clouds were finally breaking apart. "People waiting for somebody to come back." The cowboy lowered his eyes briefly at those words. Something tight inside his chest shifted painfully loose. Sarah's piano. Luke's wooden horse. 5 years of silence hanging like dust inside every room of this ranch. And somehow this stubborn woman standing beside him had walked through the front door and breathed life back into all of it without even trying. Caleb looked toward Eleanor carefully now. Not like a stranger. Not like a responsibility. Like a man slowly remembering what warmth felt like after freezing too long. "You know," he said quietly, "there is an old schoolhouse about 3 miles north of here." Eleanor blinked softly. "A schoolhouse. Been abandoned a while." Caleb shrugged slightly. "Roof leaks. Windows need work." Then after a pause he added, "But children still pass through this territory." Eleanor stared at him as the meaning settled slowly between them. The cowboy looked away almost immediately, suddenly more interested in the pasture fence than her expression. But Eleanor saw it anyway. Hope. Small. Fragile. Terrifying. She stepped closer beside him while sunlight spilled warm gold across the porch boards. Neither touched. Neither needed to. Out on the frontier, love did not always arrive like wildfire or thunder. Sometimes it came quietly, like music returning to an empty cabin, like a tired cowboy opening his door before dawn, like two broken people standing side by side beneath the Wyoming sky, finally no longer afraid of staying.